Hello, viewers, and thank you for joining me for an interview with a remarkable woman. Let me say right off that I had planned to do a video interview over Skype, but for various reasons we've had to make this an audio-only interview, but hopefully that won't be too much of a problem for you. In any case, I'm thrilled to be joined by Debbie McDaniel, a former Jehovah's Witness and survivor of childhood sexual abuse. Debbie has written about her incredible story in her book, Out with Consequences, which is available on Amazon, and I would urge all of you to check it out. Debbie, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be with you, Lloyd, this morning.
So, obviously the logical place to start, as I tend to start all my interviews, is to ask you about your background. How did you come to be involved with the witnesses?
I was about 6 or 7 when we lived in Houston, Texas, in the United States. My mother had been somewhat associated with Jehovah's Witnesses as a girl, and my dad worked with NASA. He was an engineer with the space program here in the States, and my mother, he was gone a lot, and my mother started to get pretty frustrated with that, and she started to recall some of the good things about Jehovah's Witnesses, and she basically gave him an ultimatum: you'll study with Jehovah's Witnesses or we're heading towards divorce most likely. And so he did, and he left his job ultimately after going to an international convention in Houston, Texas. He said he saw the love and unity among those people and wanted that for his family. And he left his job and moved us to Oklahoma, and was raised a very staunch Jehovah's Witness.
When you say he left his job, it's probably worth pointing out that one very interesting part of your story that I found when researching your story, because I've included it in my book, I was fascinated that your father was actually in the publications, wasn't he? Because he worked for NASA and he was instrumental in the Apollo and Gemini missions.
He was. He invented the space compass. They found in the race for space with the Russians that what they lacked was being able to tell direction in space, and so they recruited him out of college. He was really a genius by most standards, and he came up with the space compass, which belongs to NASA now because he was working for them when he designed it. And then he was instrumental in getting in the Apollo 11 and Apollo 13, when they were stuck in space, he was instrumental in getting them home.
Fantastic. So we're clearly talking about a clever man, but I think it's an important feature of the story to stress because, of course, there are so many who seem to conclude that being in a cult is all about intelligence or lack thereof, and that somehow if you find yourself wound up in a cult, well, probably you're just a bit stupid. But the fact that someone as intelligent as your father could be persuaded, it indicates, what I've been saying and many have been saying, that it doesn't really take intelligence. It's about whether you're lied to or not. So clearly your father and mother at different stages of their lives perhaps, but they were nevertheless deceived into joining the religion.
Well, I feel like what fed into particularly my father's interest in the religion was the ability to climb that ladder. There's definitely a hierarchy within that organization, and it became readily apparent when we were very, very young that his intention was to kind of hobnob with the upper echelon of the organization, and he did that.
Indeed. Now, just kind of moving on to, I know it's a very difficult subject, and obviously you don't have to go into any details that you don't want to go into, and it's obviously dealt with in your book, but fairly early on, it's fair to say that the abuse started. So can you give us some idea of what happened?
Well, when we moved to the McAlester, Oklahoma congregation, at the time they were called presiding overseers. There was a presiding overseer there by the name of Ronnie Lawrence, and he was, by any standard, a harsh, domineering man. and he took an interest in me probably about the age 7 or 8, and started inviting me over on the weekends. He would tell my parents that it was for the purpose of, he wanted me to spend the night with him because he wanted to study the Watchtower with me and prepare comments. And then sexual interest in me started right away. Immediately, he would corner me off in car groups. He would drop sisters off on the streets to work houses, and then he would take me around the corner. He would molest me in the car in service, things of that nature. And that continued until I was 13.
So, yeah, I mean, reading the story, it really is shocking because it perfectly highlights the way elders are so trusted. I mean, it sounds as though your mother and father just implicitly trusted Lawrence due to the fact that he was not just an elder, but the presiding overseer. And the way you write, it sounds as though they almost felt it was a privilege for him to take an interest in you, and that gave him access to you.
Oh, without question. When I started to realize that this wasn't, for some time I thought, well, this is just what men do to little girls. And then as I started to have behavior problems and I just didn't want to go there anymore, I begged them not to go. And I was chastised and disciplined for asking not to go because of his status in the congregation.
Now, mercifully, the abuse did stop eventually, but this was by the point you were getting into your teenage years. And you describe in your book the way you basically became a rebellious teenager, which, you know, it's perfectly natural to rebel as a teenager, but especially when you've been through that kind of ordeal. And it's fair to say that the story takes an even more remarkable and disturbing twist, because it's after you start to rebel and start to do things that Watchtower can punish you for that Lawrence started finding a whole new way to control you.
When I became sexually active, it particularly disturbed him. He would follow me. My parents kicked me out of their house, and I got an apartment and a job, and I would wake up in the morning. I didn't even have a car. I had a car before I left home, but my father wouldn't let me take it if I was going to be a worldly person. So I would walk to work, and I would look out my apartment window, and he would be parked across the street. And he would call me wanting to know who I was seeing and what we did together. And he said if I wanted forgiveness, he needed details about those things.
It's just sickening to think that someone who, basically a child molester, a pedophile who's been, you know, abusing you, is pursuing you over your perfectly normal, natural sex life and trying to hold you accountable for it. It just beggars belief that he could be so hypocritical.
And then to sit in the committee meetings with him, I was still very humbled by him for some reason. It's taken years of counseling to get past that. But for him and his father at the time were on my committee, my judicial committee, to make the decision to oust me from the congregation, it just brought me to my knees. It just buckled me.
And I'm right in saying that after you'd been through this whole ordeal of being disfellowshipped, and anyone who's been disfellowshipped knows how stressful that is, you then had this bizarre scenario where you basically had to appeal to your abuser to be allowed back into the congregation.
Well, even when I was disfellowshipped, he never stopped calling me, wanting to know what I was doing and who I was seeing and where I was going. And he kind of hammered me to apply for reinstatement. I think it was, on hindsight, more for his power trip than anything, because he then started to lay out the rules and the hoops I needed to jump through, basically, to get back into the organization.
But jump through them you did, and eventually you ended up getting reinstated. I was astonished as well to read the part where you mentioned that once it was announced that you'd been reinstated, your father wouldn't talk to you, still wouldn't talk to you until you apologized to him personally.
At the time that happened, I didn't really realize what a narcissist was. Very well versed on what a narcissist behavior is now. And I think my father fits that category. The night of my announcement, I was so excited. I couldn't bear it. I was just brimming over with excitement, waiting to talk to my mother again. And then when I walked out, everyone rushed me afterwards, and the hugging and tears and all of that stuff. And I was standing in the parking lot waiting for my father to come out, and he walked right past me. I mean, within feet of me, walked right past me and got in the car. So I called my mother later, and she said, "Well, you know, Debbie, that you owe him a personal apology," which stunned me. But in hindsight, I think, didn't that put you above Jehovah God then at that point? In his mind, I think so.
Yeah, it's astonishing behavior, but again, it kind of, especially when you read other details, and we're kind of skimming through the story, but you do build this picture of a man who did have issues. You've mentioned narcissism, but he did seem to want to control people, as you mentioned. But there you are, you've become reinstated. I think it was in this period when you were back in the religion, this was when you started to learn that you weren't Lawrence's only victim.
Well, I had an elder approach me who was about to be removed as elder. He had come forward with an assertion that while working in a rural part of the state in service, that this Ronnie had come on to him, that they had stopped to take a swim because it was so hot, and he had come on to him. This elder approached me and said that others had come to him with these same allegations, and he felt like, watching me grow up, that I might be a part of that. And so it's at that time that we all met, and we compared our stories, basically, and we couldn't believe how many victims there were.
So basically, there's this kind of groundswell of victims coming together, and action is eventually taken. And eventually, I forget now, was Lawrence disfellowshipped twice for pedophilia?
He was.
So he's disfellowshipped twice, but during all of this time, when there's judicial action being taken, I'm right in saying that first of all, you were asked to give your accusations to him in person. Is that right?
Right. And I was having kind of a difficult pregnancy at the time. And I asked to be excused from that because I was already under a lot of stress, and I had been put to bed by my doctor and things like that. And they said, absolutely not, that this disfellowshipping won't happen unless you confront him face to face, which I did.
So that must have been just incredibly difficult. I mean, I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at the Palmer leaks that have just come out, where the congregation in Massachusetts, where there were two girls whose father was abusing them, and the elders were refusing to do anything. In fact, the Watchtower instructed them not to do anything unless the girls both approached their father in person. I mean, I obviously have no idea of knowing what it must be like to go through that ordeal, and then to have the knife twisted further by giving the abuser the satisfaction of being confronted over it. It just must be awful.
Well, it was, and then I thought, well, I survived that, and this man will be handled. And my father had his best friend was a circuit overseer who said, get him out and keep him out. Well, the disfellowshipping decision was made. It was very clear what the man was. And then he appealed it, which meant that they called in a different set of elders from a different congregation, and we had to start the process completely over and go through it twice.
So even after being disfellowshipped, he's still able to control things and use the rules to his advantage. Another thing that I found appalling about your story is that you say that on multiple occasions you were kind of raising it with the elders. Well, surely, we need to let the police know about this, and I assume the police are being involved. And the elders were flat out lying to you and saying, well, actually, we've tried telling the police, but they're not interested.
They did. There was 3 of the victims, including myself, that said, wait a minute. I mean, when you're raised in that organization, you just kind of trust the bubble, is where I was. But it just, when I had my child, and I was fiercely overly protective of this child, and I thought, why was nobody protecting me? Why is this not why don't the authorities know about this? And so I went to them. 3 of us did, and they said that yes, they had consulted the authorities, and there was just nothing that they could do.
So we need to fast forward to how it did come to the attention of the authorities, because that's a real. I mean, if a film was to be made about your life, and I actually think a film should be made about your life, the really dramatic scene would be the scene where you burst into the police station and say something needs to be done about this. So try, if you can, to kind of take us up to that moment. How did it come to be that you ended up disfellowshipped, and what brought you to that point?
Well, that would be my second disfellowshipping, of course. And so I had struggled from the time I was fairly young with an attraction to same sex, and just really tried to put it to the back of my mind, tried to pray a lot. My family knew somewhat about it, but we just didn't talk about it. I had met someone, and it just seemed to coincide with the need to leave the organization anyway. And so they immediately, when I say they, I mean my parents particularly, tried to take my child from me, saying that pedophiles were the same as homosexuals, and so the child would be safer with them, and took me to court, and I had to get a lawyer and all that. They made my life an absolute living hell. They would send the police for wellness checks to our home. They would tell my child to assert that there was abuse going on in the house. My child was 12 at the time and did exactly what they said. It was a terrible time, and I thought there has to be some protection for me from this. I've suffered enough at the hands of these people. And so one night I didn't sleep at all. It was one night after they had sent the police to our house. And I said, I didn't sleep at all. I got up at daylight and waited at the police station and said, I'm not leaving here until someone helps me with this situation. I've suffered enough with sexual abuse. And they said, wait, go back to that. Before we address today's situation, let's go back to that. And so I wrote out a statement, and around that time, they did some research to see if that had ever been reported, the abuse, and there had never been any report of any abuse.
So you learn at that point that that the sense of betrayal must have been even greater, because that's when the penny drops, that you've been lied to for years, that in fact the police hadn't been informed. And of course, by the time that they did find out, we later discovered that it was too late to do anything. Can you tell us about the kind of the legal efforts that were made after that? Just kind of briefly summarize what was done.
Well, we found a note later in this investigation where my brother, also an elder, had written a note to my father, and it was in a file that they served a search warrant and finally got. It said, she's gone to the police, need to deal with ASAP, on this note. I said, all this stuff is documented. My father is a meticulous record keeper. This stuff is in a file cabinet. I know right where the file cabinet is. I had been a regular pioneer and had many pioneer meetings in that room. The police, I'm not sure how that the brothers knew that the search warrant might be served, but when the search warrant was served to get all these documents, the file cabinet was empty. The policeman called me from the elders' room. And it wasn't a few days, and my heart kind of sank because there was my proof. The police got an anonymous phone call a few days later that says serve the warrant again. And they did, and at that time, we still don't know who made that phone call, but the file cabinet was full, and every bit of my case was documented. And Ronnie was arrested and put in jail, went to court, and the judge said, I know, this is a loose quote, I know that justice isn't being served here, but the statute of limitations is clear, and it has run.
The district attorney had hoped that there was some kind of loophole, I think, but they weren't able to do anything. But here again, and I mentioned before about how much I'd love to see your story turned into a film, but the other really dramatic point and a part of the story where you're imagining it in your head and you're just thinking, I just can't imagine how that could be, is when you go to the hearing, and Ronnie Lawrence is there, and on the same side of the courtroom, siding with him, are your parents.
Right.
What on earth did that
the
feel
police
like?
The police had kept us kind of segregated away from the courtroom until time for the hearing to start because they knew it was such a sensitive, everyone's nerves were on edge. And the policeman led us out. He was also the detective that had investigated our case, led us out down a hallway. And so we passed Ronnie and his wife, and Ronnie's wife reached out and touched one of the victims and said, you have no idea how sorry I am. And we just kept walking. And when we walk into the courtroom and we see my mother and father sitting behind Ronnie at on the defendant's side of the courtroom, I'm not a big crier, not anymore, but it just overcame me. It just buckles your knees. It was horrible.
Well, reading your book, it's kind of palpable that there's a tremendous amount of hurt in the way your parents dealt with your abuse. I think probably leaning more towards your dad. I sense that you'd be ready to forgive your mother if it came to it. But especially this decision to stand by your abuser when the case went to trial. Is there a sense of betrayal there?
I think the sense of betrayal was starting to set in when they tried to take my child. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And then them sitting in the courtroom was unbelievable to me how much loyalty that they have for an organization that is so filthy.
Indeed. Now, you've mentioned your child. I'm right in saying that your child he was born a girl, but he's made the decision to be a man, and so that transition's been made, and Oliver is now going to higher education. What's this whole thing been like for Oliver, and has Oliver had any kind of backlash from your family, or has he kind of received any kind of awkwardness or difficulties due to siding with you?
Well, Oliver was baptized at the age of 11, and I won't lie, it was at my encouragement. I thought I was a regular pioneer, and my sister's kids were all getting baptized at very young ages. I feel entirely different about baptism in general now, but he had a really hard time separating himself. I remember him being in field service with my mother one day. I didn't want to just yank him from the organization as much as I wanted to because the trauma was already starting. And I called my mother and I said, I want you to bring him home. And she said, I don't answer to you. I answer to the elders. And I said, no, he's my son. Bring him home. And they hid him from me. And he felt like that at the time that was the safest place to be. He quickly started to see that something wasn't right. Something wasn't right with that situation, and he wanted to be with me full time. And they immediately blocked him on social media, made his life pretty difficult. When he contacted them about being transgender, they made it very clear to him they never wanted to hear from him again, and he's not disfellowshipped.
That's quite remarkable. I'm wondering whether they've kind of stayed execution because they're worried about any potential future legal entanglements, do you think? Or
I really don't know, because that particular congregation where I grew up is very, they're built on threats and making example of people is everything I saw growing up. That's why it took me so long to leave. I mean, they're swift. They take action pretty swiftly. So I'm not sure why he's not disfellowshipped yet.
I think, reflecting on your story and by extension Oliver's story, what kind of comes across is that there are kind of two issues almost. There's the absolute failure of the organisation to deal with child sex abuse, and there's obviously also the issue of intolerance toward homosexuality. And I'm just kind of wondering, when you think back to leaving, I know you briefly mentioned the reasons behind leaving. Do you think it's possible that you might still be a Jehovah's Witness if not for the religion's stance on homosexuality?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. It's because the attitude towards other people in general that I was raised around. I know that there would be very poor people that would ask my dad if they could take him to dinner at a district convention. I was bullied pretty bad in elementary school, so I'm always for the underdog. I want to help whoever's down. My father's the opposite. People would invite him to dinner, and he would be so nice to them and then turn to us. We always sat together at district conventions, and he would say, "We're not going to dinner with them. Don't just get your books and get out of here as soon as you can." But then when a district overseer would ask him to go to dinner, that's where we ended up. And I didn't like that behavior. It just never sat well with me.
I just want to mention as well your wife, Crystal. I had the pleasure of meeting all three of you in London back in April. And I should have mentioned that even though we can't be doing a video interview now, we did do one back then, which will be featured in the film when it's eventually released. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Crystal because obviously we're all friends on Facebook, and I get to see you guys having a very happy, fulfilled life. And I can't help but wonder how everything must look to Crystal, because obviously she wasn't raised as a witness, but she has, first of all, the whole trauma and ordeal around child abuse and how that was mismanaged. But she's also seen firsthand the lack of tolerance for both you and Oliver. And she's also seeing what I consider to be kind of a ramping up almost by Watchtower when it comes to the material that's being pushed out, against homosexuals. What does she make of it all?
Right. Crystal was herself raised in kind of a high control religious setting, although there was no disfellowshipping arrangement, and she herself struggled with coming out and living an out lifestyle as an LGBT person. She just feels like that Jehovah's Witnesses have a lot of answering to do. She confronted my dad when she saw him. She owned a salon a couple hours away for a long, long time, and she saw my dad working in field service down there, and she confronted him because she was just shocked. She wanted answers. She's not used to all the secrets, and there's so many secrets that continue to come out, and it hurts her. It hurts that she sees us suffer from time to time. Sometimes it's worse than others, but with this, particularly with homosexuality, we've become far and away much more comfortable with who we are and what our family is, and we're just going to live our lives and hope that our family comes around.
Well, that's really inspiring. In fact, as I say, I follow you guys on Facebook, and the pictures of you all together, and it's clear that despite all of the trauma and upset and pain that you've been through, and the ostracism and being betrayed by your flesh and blood, it's obvious that what you have now is very, very loving and caring, and basically the paradise that we reach for, it turns out quite often is the family that we build, and you've built a very loving family by the looks of things. I'm just wondering kind of what the takeaway is, if there's anyone listening to this interview who are themselves a victim of abuse, or perhaps they're growing up in a family where they're thinking about leaving but they're not being accepted for who they are. What would be your advice for them?
Well, there's a couple of things that run through my mind when I think about others trying to leave. One of them is that I ran into a teenage boy as I was leaving that was pretty stoked about leaving himself. He was so excited to leave, but he was doing a lot of things that he shouldn't. He was getting in trouble with the law. He was doing drugs, and it was a rebellion. And there's a big difference between leaving the organization because intellectually you've discovered that it is not God's chosen religion and that it's not the only true organization on earth. Far from it, quite the opposite. And just a rebellious leaving. A rebellious leaving, you'll likely go back because you miss your family. And if it's an intellectual leaving, then you're starting on much firmer ground to stay gone, which is what anyone needs to do. Also, to not be naive in thinking that you could even intellectually leave that organization and be okay right away. You're just not. I've not met anyone that is just okay right away. It takes counseling and years of integrating yourself into society that you didn't know existed, really, because it's not what you've been told your whole life. So I would think time, patience, and a lot of research is what needs to happen if you're serious about breaking free.
Indeed, very good advice. I agree with you entirely about, if it's just about rebellion, and it's not an intellectual thing where you on conscientious grounds you can't bring yourself to go along with it anymore, then it's almost inevitable that you're going to get guilt tripped back into the organisation. But Debbie, it's been an absolute delight going over this story. I understand it's a very difficult story, but it's an important story that I feel needs to be told, needs to be talked about. Again, I think it's feature film worthy, quite frankly. And anyone who's listening to this, if you haven't done so already, I really would recommend checking out Debbie's book Out with Consequences, which is on Amazon. It's actually quite a thin book, so it's quite easy to read and get through. The opposite of mine, you could say, which is very thick. But Debbie, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Good to talk to you, Lloyd.
Okay, so viewers, or listeners I should say, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos, and as always, thank you for listening.